Hello. Good evening. My name is Leslie King, and I'm with the Community Dialogue on Race and Racism. Glad to have you here this evening and joining us for this presentation on Blacks in Virginia, demographic trends, and the historical context, which is a part of our summer events that are going on from June until August. We also have a summer film series, and we will have a conversation on racial profiling this coming Monday, June 25th at 7 p.m. in the same location. I also have some information to pass out to you about our film series. But first, I'm happy to introduce to you and welcome Michelle Claiborne, who will be our speaker this evening. Michelle Claiborne conducts research and statistical analysis for the University of Virginia Weldon Cooper Center for the Public Service, Demographics, and Work Group. Michelle has extensive experience in statistical analysis. Prior to joining the Weldon Cooper Center, Michelle was a professor of political science at the University of Virginia and the University of Oklahoma, where she also served as a statistical consultant. She has taught undergraduate classes on research design and graduate courses on probability and statistical theory, regression analysis, time series analysis, maximum likelihood analysis, and multi-level modeling. She has also been an invited instructor at the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research's summer program on quantitative methods of social research, where she taught multi-level modeling. Her publications include Presidential Campaigns and Presidential Accountability, as well as articles and essays in the Journal of Politics, Political Research, Quarterly Political Communication, and Political Behavior. Her research on the impact of electoral campaigns has been funded by the National Science Foundation. She has a BA in Political Science from Rice University, a PhD in Political Science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her expertise is in statistical methods, survey methods, political campaigns, and statistical consulting. So if you could please help me welcome Michelle as she comes to present her research to us. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Leslie. I'm Michelle Claiborne, and right now I'm a researcher at the Demographics and Workforce Group at the University of Virginia. And our group provides a lot of accurate, timely data analysis on population and demographic issues, as well as workforce issues for the state of Virginia. But today I'm here to talk about demographic trends regarding Black and African American Virginians. And I've added, and I've got some, as well as some analysis specific to the Lynchburg community. The presentation builds on a report that we recently released on the well-being of Blacks in Virginia. And I brought some copies of that report available over on this table if anybody's interested. And if you are, I'd also invite you to contact me with questions that you might have as well. So this evening, I'm hoping to provide you with some useful facts and insights on how Blacks in Virginia are faring. And I'm going to focus on three dimensions, in particular, residential segregation, educational attainment, and economic outcomes. So before I delve in, I want to make just a general statement about my data sources. This is very much a data project. For the historical information that I'll be presenting, as well as some results for segregation, I'm relying on the decennial census for Virginia. And then there's some other work I'll be presenting, more contemporary results, particularly regarding education and economic outcomes. And for that, I'll be relying on something called the American Community Survey, which is also census data. And this is collected based on surveys collected from 2006 to 2010 in order to provide a big enough sample that we get some really robust sorts of estimates, particularly as we try to break it down to more local communities. So first, some background on the racial composition of Virginia. So here we're going to look at the percent of the Virginia population that is Black or African American based on the decennial censuses from 1850 to 2010. So while Blacks make up over 40% of Virginia's population during the post-Civil War Reconstruction era, that proportion fell steadily in every census thereafter until about 1970. Not surprisingly, right, this period encompasses Virginia's Jim Crow era. It encompasses the Great Migration of blacks from the South to the North, particularly in the 1920s. But since 1970, that proportion of black Virginians has held pretty steady at just under 19%. In the meantime, Virginia, though, continued to grow more racially diverse, primarily because of the rising presence of other racial minorities like Asians. And with the adoption, it looks also more diverse because in 2000, of course, the census adopted the practice of allowing people to identify under multiple racial identifications. And so you have a growing number. In 2010, it was 3% of Virginians identified with some more complex racial identity. The bulk of those are actually black and something in Virginia, not in the country. Given African Americans make up such a big part of Virginia's population, this 19%, the current welfare of black Virginians has a lot of consequences for the welfare of Virginia as a whole. So again, we're going to focus on these three elements. We're going to focus on where blacks live, and in particular, the segregation of blacks and whites across neighborhoods. And that has implications for the second element we'll talk about, educational achievement, I'll talk in the microphone, educational achievement of black Virginians. And we'll talk about that both in absolute terms and relative to white Virginians, the majority of the state. And that'll lead us to the third element, a comparison of economic outcomes for blacks, and in particular with respect to employment and income. So we're going to start with the first element, where blacks live. And we're going to start with Lynchburg. So in 2010, in the 2010 census, 18% of the residents of the Lynchburg metropolitan statistical area identified as black or African American, very near the state total of 19%. So a metro area, just to be clear, contains a core urban area of 50,000 or more. In this case, that's the city of Lynchburg, with 75,000 plus citizens. And it includes the adjacent counties that have some high degree of social and economic integration with the core area, and that's measured by commuting from home to work. So we can think of the metropolitan area as encompassing a common labor market. The Lynchburg metro is defined here. It's defined as the cities of Lynchburg and Bedford, and the counties of Amherst, Appomattox, Bedford, and Campbell. There are 252,000 people in the Lynchburg metro. And so when I talk about Lynchburg, I'll primarily be talking about the larger Lynchburg metro area. Given the economic integration that's the source of this definition, we'd expect issues central to the metro core to impact the larger area as well. So this map shows the percent of African Americans in each locality. And it's unsurprisingly, I'm sure you are, as you already know, but it's nice sometimes to see it in pictures. You can see that blacks are unevenly distributed across the Lynchburg metro, with the highest proportion in the city itself at 29%, and about 1/5 of Bedford City, Amherst County, and Appomattox County residents identify as black or African American. And then the percent of black drops comparatively in Campbell County with only 14%, and it's really quite small in Bedford County with 6%. So again, 18% of Lynchburg metro residents are black or African American, and half of those live in the city of Lynchburg itself. These heavier concentrations in the city of Lynchburg and the very low concentrations in some of the adjacent counties like Bedford is one way in which whites and blacks are segregated. But we can also look at segregation across neighborhoods. Here I'm going to define neighborhoods as census tracts. Census tracts are subdivisions of a county that usually contain between 2,000 and 7,000 people. They're designed to be relatively permanent so that you can make comparisons across time, and they're designed to be relatively homogeneous with respect to population characteristics and economic conditions. So they're supposed to encapsulate something that you might identify as an actual neighborhood. Now, the most common way of measuring residential segregation across neighborhoods is between blacks and whites, or between any group that you choose. In this case, I'm using blacks and whites, is to measure how evenly blacks and whites are distributed throughout the neighborhoods in that larger metro area. The segregation measure ranges, that I'm going to show you, ranges from 0 to 100. 0 represents absolutely no segregation whatsoever. Blacks and whites would be found in every neighborhood in the same proportion that they are found in the overall metro area. So in the Lynchburg metro, for there to be zero segregation, we'd have to see 18% of every census tract be composed of blacks or African Americans. 100, the high score, represents complete segregation, and it would be found if blacks and whites lived in completely separate neighborhoods. Now, those are the extremes, 0 and 100. They're not usually the numbers we see when we do this measure, but demographers generally call values greater than 60 indicative of high residential segregation, and values between 30 and 60 representing moderate segregation. So a value, another way of interpreting this measure before I give it to you, is that a value of, say, 40 would mean that 40% of blacks in the metro, or you could say 40% of whites in the metro, would need to move to another neighborhood in order to produce a proportional distribution, in order to get evenness across the census tracts. So this graph starts by showing the residential segregation score, that 0 to 100 score, between blacks and whites from 1970 to 2010. So residential segregation in the Lynchburg metro is in the moderate range. In 1970, it was 45. In 2010, it's 37. And here, for comparison, is just the city of Lynchburg alone, right? The first line was the larger Lynchburg metro. Here's the city of Lynchburg, the dashed line, with a somewhat higher segregation score across this time period, but also bigger declines in recent decades. So in 1970, the segregation score for Lynchburg, the city of Lynchburg, was 62. In 2010, it's 43. And I initially hadn't done the city of Lynchburg, and I was talking to some colleagues about it, and they said, well, I don't believe that measure represents Lynchburg City. I feel like they suggested they thought Lynchburg City would look more segregated than the metro area. So to appease that concern, I did it for the city of Lynchburg, and they're actually surprisingly close. I was surprised, at least. Now, the Lynchburg metro, the segregation score for the Lynchburg metro, for comparison, is generally lower than the other moderate to large metropolitan areas in Virginia. So here I've included everything of 200,000 or more, except for DC, because that includes so much that's not Virginia. So in Roanoke, the 2010 segregation score is 55, and in Richmond it's 52, Norfolk it's 47, and Charlottesville it's 33. And just for comparison, again, to kind of put this into context, the average segregation score across the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the entire country is 55. So we're kind of around that national average. Now these measures, it's hard to measure this prior to 1970, in part because we don't have consistent census tracts to use in order to define neighborhoods prior to that period. So these scores all are measured after the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which prohibited discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing. So the good news is that things seem to improve since then, but it still falls in every single metro somewhere in that moderate range of residential segregation. So one way you might look at this graph and interpret it is, gee, Lynchburg metro actually doing pretty well with regard to residential segregation, at least compared to a lot of the other metros in Virginia. So I think it's helpful to have a closer look at what 37 looks like. So we're going to take a look at the Lynchburg metro map to help make this value 37 more meaningful. And we're going to start by showing only the census tracts that have large concentrations of blacks. In this case, 70% or more of the residents in that neighborhood are black. There's not very many. There's that little blue, right? We get this little blue spot over here. And even when we add majority black, 50 to 70%, we only add a few more little neighborhoods. This is really small. It's hard to see. So we're going to blow it up. And we can see that the heaviest concentrations are clearly in this eastern part of the city. The highest census tract has 91%. It's that one. But if I wrote that on the map, it gets all mucky. You can't see it very well. But these are all 75% or more, in fact. So I don't really know that much, to be honest, about the layout of the city of Lynchburg. So I'm going to guess this won't surprise you if you're from here. And while we're up close, let's fill in the other census tracts in the city. The colors are showing up a little different than I'd hoped, but that'll work for us. And while we're close, let's also add some roads to help orient us a little bit. I know when people show me a map, sometimes I have to know, well, what's that near? So to kind of position yourself with the roads, we can see that while the eastern blocks are predominantly black, I mean, very heavy concentrations, right? The northern tracts, predominantly white. And the south, the sort of southern tracts here are more proportional. They're the same color, let's step aside here, they're the same color as this 10 to 30%, right? 10 to 30% encompasses the metro's total, 18%, right? So those are in the range. Those look relatively integrated. Everything that's not that color is a deviation from fully integrated. So that's City of Lynchburg. Let's go back to the metro. And here I've added the tracts that have 30 to 50% black. And again, there's not that many of them, right? There's a few more in the City of Lynchburg, a couple in the counties, but it's relatively few. In fact, in the bulk of the Lynchburg metro, most of the census tracts contain between 10 and 30% of the residents being African American. Again, this encompasses that 18% total, which is why you get not a really high segregation score, but a moderate one. A big part of the metro has about proportional distribution of blacks and whites. And then there's some with very little, showing up really light so you can't see it. But yeah, that was there. Sorry. Making sure it's still there. The part that looks almost white here, right, is obviously Bedford. Bedford only had 6% of the entire county residents identifying as black, so most of the census tracts in Bedford are also have quite low concentrations as well. Now again, it's these dark blue neighborhoods and these kind of dark green neighborhoods in the City of Lynchburg, and then those really pale neighborhoods in the City of Lynchburg and then in Bedford that are what are sort of upping this residential segregation score. That's where it's coming from. That's what the moderate segregation, that's where it derives. So why am I showing you segregation, right? Why are we measuring this? And demographers have spent a lot of time coming up with measures of residential segregation. And we care because residential segregation impacts the social and economic environments that both blacks and whites live in. There's a seminal book from 1993 called American Apartheid, Segregation and the Making of the Underclass, where the authors go to great lengths to quite amply demonstrate that blacks who live in very segregated places have a very different lived experience than blacks who live in integrated neighborhoods. They experience more exposure to poverty, increased joblessness, less educational success, and poorer health outcomes. Just as an example, one of the causes that demographers have really started to tease out, or have teased out in the last decade, regarding employment is that residential segregation impacts access to employment because often low-skilled, better-paying jobs move out of the urban cores where blacks tend to be concentrated, making them less accessible, right? Making employment opportunities less accessible. In fact, most of the challenges of segregation, of residential segregation, again, I'm talking about residential segregation, not specifically talking about school segregation, but most of the challenges of residential segregation arise because residential segregation tends to concentrate poverty as well. Where you see high levels of segregation, you tend to see most of the people who are in poverty also clustered together in a few number of neighborhoods. And that concentration of poverty produces additional challenges for the communities concerned. Education is one of those big concerns. Because public elementary schools are organized primarily by neighborhoods, residential segregation shapes school segregation. Right? Residential segregation tends to concentrate poverty. Highly segregated minority schools, as a consequence, tend to have more children in poverty, more students who enter school less prepared, have a harder time attracting more experienced teachers. So children and teachers in more racially segregated schools often face more obstacles while generally enjoying fewer resources. It's a big challenge, right? So we care about residential segregation because it has a lot of consequences for other life experiences. But I'm going to focus on education now. We're going to turn to education. Education, of course, is the locus of a major part of the black community's long fight for equality. And of course, when the Supreme Court mandated the desegregation of public schools in the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling, Virginia resisted. primarily by closing schools that faced desegregation orders. And while the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals and the United States District Court overturned massive resistance efforts in January of 1959, it didn't end, right? Some schools just held out. Prince Edward County, for instance, kept their schools closed until 1964 in order to avoid integration. So this is all very, very recent history. So given that, we want to look at how educational attainment has changed over time. Here, we have the proportion of adult blacks, those aged 25 or over, so anybody under 25 is excluded from this because they might still be in school or acquiring education. The proportion of adult blacks that lack a high school degree in each census from 1940 in the beginning to 2010. So clearly, this proportion has fallen precipitously since the 1940s. And you can't see it, but there's a gray bar there that identifies the periods of Board of Education and massive resistance as well. So you can sort of see if there's any change and any acceleration in that period, and there is. You can kind of see the kink up there, which pretty much follows that period of time when schools were finally starting to integrate. Now, finishing high school didn't actually become an established norm for Americans until after World War II. Plenty of people didn't finish high school, and it wasn't that peculiar. And so much of this decline is due to this increasing norm that one at least finishes high school. And the proportion of adult white Virginians without a high school degree also falls dramatically during the same period. It doesn't fall quite as quickly, though, as it does for blacks. Consequently, the gap between blacks and whites without a high school degree is at its lowest point yet in 2010. There's only a gap of 8%. And towards the end of massive resistance in 1960, the gap was 27%, because 95% of blacks lacked a high school degree compared to 17%, excuse me, that's 17%. No, that's 11%. Excuse me. It was 94 versus 84. So we've dropped since then. No, I'm sorry. I'm looking at my notes. I'm looking at a different part of my notes. It's 27%, and we've reduced it to 8%. It's been reduced. So we see some progress, at least, in closing the racial gap amongst the least educated in Virginia. What about at the high end, a college degree? So here, too, blacks have made enormous progress, and particularly when we recall that many colleges and universities, in particular public colleges and universities in the state, have only accepted blacks without some sort of restriction since the early 70s, even more recent history. And the proportion of adult black Virginians with a college degree has grown. By 2010, it was up to 20%. And here you really can sort of see an increase, an acceleration of that, right around the period where college education becomes more widely accessible. In the same period, the rate of college degree attainment among adult white Virginians has grown, and it's grown at a slightly faster rate, which means that the gap between blacks and whites with college degrees in 2010 is actually at its highest point, at 17%. In 1970, when colleges were just starting to accept black applicants more generally, the gap was 10% because only 14% of whites had a college degree compared to 4% of blacks. But given the increasing importance of a college degree to securing some sort of economically secure future, the growing gap is really quite troubling. So we're going to look at Lynchburg, which I can't do as easily historically. We'll look at 2010. Actually, I'm sorry, based on the data from 2006 to 2010. And looking at the Lynchburg metro, again, the whole metro area, we see quite similar disparities. A quarter of black residents in the Lynchburg metro lack a high school degree, adults, age 25 and over, compared to 15% of white adults. And, sorry, those numbers really, they were much darker on my computer screen. And so it's 25% of blacks lack a high school degree compared to 15% of whites. And 2/3 of black residents have a high school degree or less compared to under half of the white residents, around 46%, which is a really big gap. Just a quarter or just over a quarter of both black and white adult residents in the Lynchburg metro have some college in their background but not a bachelor's degree. So this is, maybe they have an associate's degree or maybe they just went to college but didn't finish. And while about a quarter of white residents possess a college degree or more, that's more than 3 times the rate of college attainment amongst black adults in the Lynchburg Metro, only 8%. And again, that's a really big gap. So unquestionably, these differences in educational attainment affect this third dimension I want to talk about, the economic well-being of blacks compared to whites in Virginia. We know, for instance, that the unemployment rates are higher for those who are less educated, and African Americans in Virginia as a whole are about 5% more likely to be unemployed than white Virginians. And much of that is clearly due to these educational differences. But, somewhat surprisingly and quite importantly, the differences persist even when we compare black and white adult Virginians with the exact same level of education. So here we can compare the unemployment rate among, say, blacks with a high school degree and whites with a high school degree. So 11% of blacks with a high school degree are unemployed compared to 6% of whites, right? A 5% gap. The gap is 7% for those who lack a high school degree, right? The gap closes, or at least it's reduced as educational attainment increases, but it doesn't disappear entirely. In Lynchburg, now we've switched to Lynchburg, the pattern is similar. We have about a 7% gap overall between the unemployment rate of blacks and whites, but these continued notable gaps amongst blacks and whites, even with the same level of educational attainment. So we've got this, 7% gap for those without a high school degree, a 9% gap amongst those who went to high school but no further, a 9% gap. That's more than double, right, the black unemployment rate relative to the white unemployment rate. That's huge. The gap starts to decline some. It's 3% and 4% amongst those with more education, but there's still this troubling gap. That is not a function. It might be a function of many things, but it's not a function of blacks having less education than whites. So higher unemployment rates mean, as a group, that blacks have lower median incomes than do whites. Median income, just to be really clear, is the income for which half of the population earns more than that number and half earns less. So it's a really good measure of sort of what's typical. It's not an average, right? It's just what's kind of common. But even comparing only full-time working Virginians, so ignoring the fact that blacks are more likely to be unemployed and therefore earning no income, right? Removing them from the equation and comparing only full-time working Virginians, which is what this comparison does, we see a pretty big racial difference in median income amongst individuals. The median income of full-time working whites is $47,000 a year. For blacks, it's $33,000 a year. So in other words, the median income for black Virginians is $14,000 less, or 28% less, than the median income for white Virginians. And again, you can probably tell where I'm going with this, based on what's left here. When I compare by level of educational attainment, along with being a full-time working Virginian, it doesn't make the difference go away. So, for instance, the median income of white Virginians with a college degree is $61,000, right? That red line next to the last red line there. For similarly educated black Virginians, it's $48,000. Again, a $13,000 difference. Across each of these levels of education for Virginia, blacks earn about 20% less than whites. Further, I don't have a graph for it because it's more complicated to show. In a fuller statistical model that tries to account for a lot of the other things that might be going on, in particular, gender, age, marital status, the presence of children, whether people are a single parent or not, region of the state they live in, since incomes vary by region, and occupation, the differences don't go away. Right? So even when we try to explain away, well, some of this might be different occupational choices, or some of this might be people are concentrated in different areas of the state, and those aren't the same. Or some of it might be different family structures, but when you control for that, you still see differences. They get a little smaller, but they don't go away. So this is Virginia. I went back into the same thing for the Lynchburg metro area. So here's Lynchburg Metro. And we see similar kinds of differences. Though here the differences between blacks and whites are somewhat smaller, primarily though because incomes are lower here than they are in Virginia as a whole, which is hugely influenced by the much bigger incomes in Northern Virginia. Any place you compared to the state as a whole is going to look smaller unless you're comparing Northern Virginia. But there are still these gaps. So among those with a college degree in the Lynchburg Metro, there's a $7,000 racial gap in median income. Among those with a master's degree or more, there's a $13,000 gap. And again, this is for full-time working Virginians, right? So it's not that they work different number of hours, right? We're controlled for that. And I want to point out here in particular, amongst the least educated, those without a high school degree, there's a $10,000 racial gap in median income. And that's a world of difference between $16,000 and $26,000 annual income. So in Virginia and in the Lynchburg Metro too, the people most at risk economically due to having less education are at even more risk than we might have previously understood given the racial disparity in incomes. So, forgot to change my picture. I presented some recent data on 3 dimensions of the well-being of black Virginians, about segregation, some about educational attainment, and some about economic outcomes, unemployment, and income. So what can we say? First, just in summary, rates of residential segregation in Virginia's large metropolitan areas remain moderately high, with little change in the last 2 decades, but definite improvement compared to the prior decades. So most of the improvement occurred between 1970 and 1990, and then it's been pretty stable since then. In the Lynchburg Metro, we see some very high concentrations of blacks in the eastern parts of the city and very low concentrations in the north part of the city, and then the broader metro throughout Bedford County as well. And even in the face of a challenging history of exclusion from education from both elementary and secondary schools and colleges, we see really amazing gains in education among black Virginians in the last several decades. But blacks still lag far behind the educational attainment of white, and the college gap is growing. And college is sort of where things are now, right, in terms of people thinking, what's the sort of minimum to have a middle-class lifestyle? And third, in looking at the median income, a measure of the sort of typical income between whites and blacks, whites still out-earn blacks, even when we compare only full-time working blacks and whites with the same level of education. And we see similar sorts of differences in unemployment as well, which actually serves to make those income differences even more severe in reality, right? By removing them, you don't see just how big the income differences are. So when Leslie asked me to come talk, I was looking up many voices in one community, and partly how I want to summarize is that the mission of Many Voices, One Community, to create a racially equitable community where race and or ethnicity are not predictors of success in any aspect of life, well, that's really still far from realized, right, in Virginia and in the Lynchburg Metro. Not surprising, but sometimes it's good to sort of see it in kind of black and white, so to speak. And because these differences are in part a reflection of long-standing structural inequalities in the housing markets, in the access to education, in access to employment opportunities, in government policies, right? There's a lot that went into creating these inequalities in the first place. Consequently, they're stubbornly resistant to change. But there have been signs of improvement. I feel like my message has been kind of negative, so let me just try to frame a little bit. There have been reframe a little bit. There have been signs of improvement, but there's no question that more progress will require continued efforts to ensure, again, as the Many Voices, One Community mission states, that public policies, institutional practices, and social structures no longer favor one group of people over another. So I'd like to open the floor to your questions, thoughts, or discussion. Thank you.
What is their solution?
What is the solution, huh? That's the hard question. I actually do think, right, that it's not an individual solution, it's an institutional solution. You can't overcome inequalities of this size through individual behavior for people making better individual choices. It requires some larger collective kind of force, right? And in fact, you can see that. You can see when you see residential segregation decline, it's at least in part due to government intervention to the Fair Housing Act, right? When you see the educational attainment improve, it's largely after an intervention, a government intervention, forcing the opening of schools, of colleges to blacks, forcing the integration of public schools. To be honest, where you most see improvement, it follows some government-mandated change. So, I don't know, historically, you don't see a lot of improvement until some policy changes, right? Although I'm willing to hear what other people have to suggest about that.
Well, it's certainly in line with our theory of change, or one of our theories of change with community dialogue, and that's looking at structural racism, looking at systems, and looking at policies, looking at institutions. So not just looking at racism from an individual perspective, but looking at how those policies or practices perpetuate this disparity, and how can we influence change from our various spheres of influence. But the question that I have is, were you able to look at wealth disparity? Because I think there's a big difference between income and wealth, and how that's inherited and passed down from generation to generation. And while income is one thing, and wealth definitely is another. So I was just curious as you looked at it.
Right, I haven't. There's an excellent scholar whose name, Melvin Oliver. That's it, thank you. That looks at, has written about the wealth gap. It's different and bigger, right, than the income gap. We don't have the data sources I was using, the American Community Survey, we don't have measures of wealth, but we do have things like home ownership, and that's a big part of wealth accumulation and wealth transfer between generations, is home ownership. And I wrote this one down, actually. Black householders in Virginia, 51% rent their homes compared to 27% of white householders. And so, again, it's about double the rate of renting or half the rate of owning, however you want to frame that, amongst blacks and whites. And again, since that's a key component of wealth accumulation, that kind of difference in home ownership rates is going to exacerbate the income gap, make a much bigger wealth gap, a gap in overall assets to which people have access that they can use for their own, improvement. So I don't have wealth, but we know from other research that it's bigger than the income gap, and sort of as one indicator that might be home ownership, is unquestionably home ownership, right? And that there's a huge gap between owning. And those data, by the way, were for Virginia, not Lynchburg. I wrote this report a couple months ago, and I actually got a lot of people saying, so what do what's the solution? And it sounds terrible to punt and say, look, I'm not a policymaker, because I'm not a policymaker, but I do think there is no solution forthcoming as long as people are allowed to misperceive or believe poor information. And so part of my goal in the report was I really wanted to know how much inequality is there. And if you try to control for some of the things that people are going to say, oh, well, it's this, and then potentially try to attribute to personal choices instead of institutional barriers, because they don't want to see it. So I'm trying to control away a lot of that. And I think part of my goal is to sort of be really kind of blunt about the magnitude of the disparities that exist, which cannot be attributed to the sorts of individual choices that certain segments of the political realm like to pawn responsibility towards, right? They're clearly due to something else. They're clearly due to more institutional structures or barriers or challenges. So part of my goal is to try to make those try to make the differences harder to refute. Because if you're going to let yourself believe, oh, everybody's doing fine now, and let yourself believe, which obviously you don't, right? But no question, there are people saying, well, there is a level playing field, right? There is equal opportunity, if not equal outcome. And so part of what I want to do with the data is try to sort of verify, if that's true, that's great, but the data in no way suggests that's true, right? The data suggests there isn't a level playing field, they're not equal opportunities, and as an empiricist, I feel like my role is to sort of say, you can't deny the data, right? It's quality data. You can reinterpret it if you like, but you can't wish it away. In part because I feel like part of the problem you're identifying is people sort of being willfully ignorant of the differences. And I guess I do mean that badly. There's no way to sort of say that in a polite way. But just trying to wave away the fact that there are really disparate kinds of outcomes. And so I feel like at least one step, in my mind, there's no solution possible unless people acknowledge that there are real differences here that aren't due to people behaving in, more or less, beneficial ways, which is an argument I feel like I hear coming a lot from certain political quarters. So I feel like at a minimum, people have to be confronted with the reality as best we can capture it, right? And for some people, I think they're going to be more persuaded by data, and then there are plenty of other people for whom data is just going to, it's numbers, right? It's not meaningful. Who need to hear the experiences, the kinds of experiences that you're talking about, right? They need to hear it in really personal terms. And so I feel like there's, room for both kinds of strategies, and both are necessary, right? People need to hear the personal experiences and to sort of understand from a personal view how things seem to have changed or failed to change. And I think people need to see the data, and I think those are kind of converging for a similar purpose in my mind a little bit. But yeah, I'm not particularly optimistic, sadly, because I study power as a political scientist, and power doesn't give up, people in power don't give up power, right? It has to be wrenched from them. And the kinds of things you're talking about, the decline of union power, for instance, right? That denies communities of need a source of power. And that's a problem, right? You can't take power away from the powerful without some counteracting force. And part of the problem you're describing is the weakness of those counteracting forces. I'm so sorry, I'll stop now. Let's see. Yeah. Well, part of it, was I started working at the Demography Center. And I wasn't actually previously a demographer. I was previously a political scientist. And a lot of what I studied was campaigns and the mobilization of different constituencies in the campaigns, and particularly marginalized constituencies. So it was, in stepping into a new position, it was sort of trying to marry some of my prior interests with interests that I thought would be of value to Virginia, right? We're Virginia demographers. We try and understand Virginia. And so it kind of was a pre-existing interest of mine, and I never studied Virginia before. I'd always studied it at a national level. And so in starting the project, I really did want to, from the point, I was surprised when I entered my demography shop that we hadn't done any studies on blacks in Virginia. We've done studies on Hispanics in Virginia and Asians in Virginia, but blacks, who comprise the largest minority in the state, we really didn't have anything on, which seemed like a missing piece, right? And so part of it was I wanted to fill that gap. It seemed like a really important segment of the entire state, and we weren't really conveying up-to-date information on how African Americans were doing. So, that was kind of how it arrived. In truth, what I hope would happen, we send our reports out to lawmakers and all sorts of agencies and things like that, and maybe they read them and maybe they don't. But my most optimistic hope is precisely that people would see it and say, wow, really? That's crazy. How can we let that stand? Right? Again, that's a little Pollyanna-ish, but it really was to try to introduce some data into the discourse so that we could begin to have a conversation on common ground, right? So that we weren't constantly having conversations where we're all talking from different realities, right? I wanted to provide some sort of relatively current, relatively sophisticated analysis that would be a starting point for conversation. So unless you're just going to deny the existence of a result, right, you have to confront it. And then you can confront it by either saying you don't care, or you can confront it by saying, okay, this is a problem, what can we do? And I'm doing something there. So sorry about that noise. So my hope is that people would see it. People in positions of authority would see it, and it would penetrate their minds in some small niggling way so that you'd have to think about it, right? So that it have to be part of what you're thinking of when you're thinking about policy, when you're thinking about implementing policy on the ground or in the General Assembly or wherever. There was a question here.
Have you or has anyone, well, let me start again. One of the forms in which white privilege, on form it takes, is an assumption about going to college and access to elite colleges. You look at the people in very big positions of power in our government, Harvard, Princeton, sometimes Yale, maybe a few research universities. What I'm trying to say is not all colleges are regarded as equal by employers. So has anybody looked to see whether any of the discrepancy in pay has to do with
Where you go.
what colleges? Am I making sense?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Certainly not for Virginia. Nobody's done that, and it would be hard to do. The kind of, again, the data sources that we have ready access to that you can look at a state level doesn't have that detail. On the national level, there has been work, and I'm not going to remember enough details to convey it properly, but I have seen work on the degree to which elite colleges, the degree to which where you go makes a difference in income, basically, in economic outcomes. Most of that's just looking at elite colleges, not comparing racial differences, but the work on going to the right colleges and developing the right networks of people who are going to be able to help you along the way, right? There's sort of indisputable benefit to that. And so, because you can also see that minorities are underrepresented at most of the elite colleges, right? It's not a very hard logical step to say that they're also going to be disproportionately, they're going to receive a disproportionate amount of the benefits, right? They're not going to get the benefits of that. So I haven't seen specific work on connecting the two, right? But I've seen specific work on the value of the elite colleges, and you can go, to the main national data source and see the proportion of, say, African Americans or Hispanics or Asians at any of the colleges, and it's and blacks in particular are quite underrepresented at the elite institutions. Actually, we have a blog, and I had recently looked at college, just Virginia public and private colleges, and one of the things I looked at was the proportion of blacks actually across the different colleges, and I was surprised. I was actually, given I shouldn't be. I'm at University of Virginia every day. I don't know why this surprises me, but sometimes when you see it in data, it does nonetheless surprise you just how, a handful of public colleges and universities in Virginia educate the majority of blacks who get a college education, right? They're very disproportionately distributed across the colleges. So, UVA doesn't have a full representation. And so I think even on a local level, where I have sort of looked more at the Virginia college data, you see that kind of same, uneven distribution.
I have a question. Have you presented this data to any of the powers that be in the state, like in Richmond? And where is it going? What's the purpose? And what can possible outcomes be? Because it's good information, but the overt discrimination is obvious. Whether it's from 18-something up to 2010, however you want to categorize it. and what has happened in between. But you have all this interesting data, and you mentioned the legislature. Do you have any intention of presenting it so that we can get some results from what your findings are?
Well, I hoped I had, in a way. I mean, in the report we distributed it to lawmakers, and we distributed it to local officials as well. What they do with it after that, I don't know. No, I mean, in this report, we were really actually kind of pleased that we got quite a bit of media attention immediately after. So, I know there was coverage in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, so over in Richmond and Rowan, Rowan. I mean, I was keeping a list for a while of the papers that covered the story, and then I stopped because it was pretty good coverage in the media amongst Virginia. So on that level, I was pleased in the hopes that that sort of media coverage might get more attention than just sending a report out to a, I'm sure, quite busy, part-time legislator who doesn't have enough staff to keep him briefed on everything or something, right? But no, I mean, I have no particular way of going to present it to them unless I'm invited, right? And I don't see that happening. Yeah, Leslie invited me here, and so I'm not really sure strategically how to do that, to be honest.
I'd like to go back to what Carla said just a minute ago. I went to my daughter's graduation in Raleigh from Shaw University. And right after graduation, we went across town to North Carolina State. Graduation, my daughter said, Dad, I want to show you something. Here we have a couple of dignitaries. So when we got over to North Carolina State, that was the IBM tents. That was every big United States steel, every big industry that you could think of had a hospitality tent. So when you think of educational disparity, it just popped into my mind when she said that. I said, oh my God, that's exactly what I experienced with my daughter. We experienced the same thing. She had to go back to school to get an additional education after she had graduated from college to be on the same level with people from the state. I had forgotten that, but
Right, and I mean that's an issue of recruitment, right? If industries if they're recruiting on only select sorts of campuses, right? You get this additional challenge in having equal access, right? That actually strikes me. I hadn't really thought about that, but that actually strikes me as something that one could take up, for instance, with a career services office at a university, and should. It's a lovely point, and I'm going to write it down so I don't forget it, because I think it may well be something that could be ameliorated to some extent with less effort, maybe, right? If you could get, again, universities' career services offices, part of their job is to bring recruiters to campus, right? You could maybe try to work, not you specifically, but one could try to work through those angles, and that's another avenue of trying to, disperse a little bit that kind of different treatment that you might see. Listen.
I was just wondering about, from your political scientist perspective, what are the implications from, this data in terms of a political science perspective? Now, you kind of hinted toward it, but can you kind of share just basically what you think? How does the disparity impact mobilizing market? How does, yeah.
Right. No. Yeah. One of the things I study is political participation in campaigns, and it's widely understood, right, amongst people who study political behavior that the things that predict participation are education, money, time, in a way, sort of resources, and these are all things that minority communities, and particularly African American communities, tend to have less of, right? And there's also sort of this idea of mobilizing by engaging interests, and candidates don't usually do that, honestly, that often. But there's a long-standing, right? Black turnout's historically been much lower say, than white turnout. Although interestingly, because I was looking at it in 2008, black turnout in Virginia actually matched white turnout in Virginia. But that was the first time ever in the state's history from which we have data, which is really only from the 1960s. But I'm pretty sure it didn't, outside of Reconstruction era, probably didn't match. That's important because, power and political leaders are motivated by participation, right? And to the degree that blacks have been quite underrepresented in the electorate, it disincentivizes attention amongst political leaders. And then it's kind of a vicious circle because then if campaign consultants know that it's easier to mobilize certain kinds of people than others, and so they exert more effort into mobilizing the easily mobilized. And so it's kind of a problem that perpetuates itself. Turnout's low, so people don't try to mobilize you. So turnout remains low. And in fact, there's a lot of work in political science that suggests politicians actually prefer it that way because then they don't have to deal with the demands of different constituencies, right? It's easier to have a more homogeneous electorate making similar kinds of demands instead of quite inconsistent demands that you have to negotiate. So there's very little incentive, frankly, for most leaders to mobilize more widely, except under kind of somewhat unusual circumstances. But I think there's no question that in my political science hat, right, participation matters. There's some great studies about, many from the 70s, about where communities where blacks suddenly voted in numbers that represented their proportion in the population in cities. So it's a lot of city politics. And things changed, right? It mattered. It made a difference. They started having, improvements to the neighborhood where previously no resources had been allocated to their neighborhoods and things like that. More money on public education where previously had been defunded, sort of thing. So you see, there's definitely some excellent case studies of where political participation actually has consequential political outcomes, right, that improve the lives of minority communities. I think that's a huge source of power. When I say that I think government intervention is often necessary, I really mean forced through political participation of interested parties who have to make demands and have to make their voices heard. And I'm, as a political scientist who studies elections, I want everybody to participate, and I'm saddened by the lack of it. But certainly that matters, right? Mobilizing in the community matters. Getting people to vote matters. Getting politicians to think that their electoral future might depend on the margin they get in certain communities is important, right? It gets attention, and attention means voice, and voice can sometimes mean improvement. Right, but I think it's a precursor.
Thank you. All right, thank you.
And I just thank Michelle again for coming, and actually I did invite her because I thought that the data would be good to integrate into our conversation about race and racism from the state level as well as the local level. So I appreciate her sharing that information with us. And she also has some of the data there if you want to take it with you in paper form. And just to kind of echo what she said about political power, Frederick Douglass said that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. So there certainly is a lot of work for us to do in our community, and we have done a lot of work. And also, I just want to remind you that we have some information on some upcoming events, and also if you would like to get more engaged with the community dialogue to identify ways that we can impact change in our community, come see me afterwards. Thank you, and have a good night.